a little while ago, there was a huge kerfuffle in the community when Zenith released their new Chronomaster. The comparisons to the Rolex Daytona were inevitable. They were sometimes quite vicious, and don't worry, I'm not going to refight that fight. But as I went back through the arguments for and against the idea that the Chronomaster was a knockoff of the Daytona, I found some really interesting splits in how we, the watch community, look at, talk about, think about watches. And I really identified 10 key areas where I think we diverge from each other. And that's what I want to talk about today. The 10 points at which we in the community who know a lot about watches, this isn't about what you know and don't know, but where people who know and care and think about watches depart and diverge from each other. Join me on the other side. Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville, and as I said, I promise not to get into the argument of whether the Zenith Chronomaster was a rip-off of the Rolex Daytona or whatever. It's not that I don't care, it wasn't, but really in going into the argument and looking at the arguments, what was more interesting, what was more lasting for me was actually the kind of, where was it that people with good faith who knew about watches ended up coming up, looking at the same facts, ended up forming very different opinions? What were the points in the argument that we diverged? And I identified 10 of them, and it's probably going to come through that I've obviously got a preference for one or the other side of those points, but I don't want to go down into that too much today. All I'm going to do is very quickly kind of identify and very briefly describe where I thought those points were. And I might do some more talking about this and analysis in a later video. So with nothing else, here are the 10 points of difference I found in the watch community over how we look at watches. The first is what I'll call, and I think the big one is the first impression. There's one group of people who think that the first impression is everything. The first impression is truth. And that everything that comes after the first impression or the thinking and the analysis is inherently untrustworthy. It's almost certainly a rationalization of what you think you would like to be true, not necessarily what your senses immediately gave you, which is the real truth. The flip side of that is the other side of the community who are inherently distrustful of that first look, who think that the first look is itself intrinsically flawed, has all sorts of biases built into it, and that only by getting past that first look, only by working through that in a really structured and logical way, can you get to the truth about a watch. Now I've put this one up front because this one's particularly problematic because of all the points I've discovered. It's the only one in which part of the bedrock of its belief is that the opposing side must be wrong. If you believe in one, you cannot accept, you discredit the very point of the other one. And that makes this one a particularly dangerous point because it does make it difficult to even move past this. And I saw that a lot with the Zenith Chronomaster sort of Rolex Daytona discussion. A lot of the debate stopped really early on that point of people not being able to move past a first impression. Okay, so the next is a group of two, which I'm going to call the big issues that kind of define how people even think about the playing area and all the rules that come next. The first is fairly obvious and should come as no surprise: brand bias. The way you have been preconditioned to look and think about a brand clearly impacts everything that comes next. If you, in this case, if you're pro Rolex or pro Zenith or anti one or anti the other, that clearly impacted people's decisions as they moved down. There were people who would die in a ditch to defend Zenith no matter what, sometimes saying things that really actually they're so desperate to defend their own brand, they're actually saying things that are actually harmful to their brand's case. While at the other time, on the other side, there were times where Rolex people were speaking as though they couldn't understand that everyone doesn't want a Rolex. They really struggle. They just naturally assume everyone wants a Rolex. By definition, therefore, every watch is trying to copy a Rolex. And if you have if you have something that looks like a Rolex and it's not a Rolex, that's obviously going to be the end of the world for you. The idea to them that there'd be people who like a nice white dialed chronograph and value that it's not a Rolex would be an anathema to them. It would blow their minds. And that doesn't seem to factor into their thinking at all. So it's that idea of brand bias plays on both sides of the argument. And again, it's a very common and probably inevitable thing in this game of ours. The next point, which I'd say is really large and impacts on everything, is kind of how much faith you have or how much trust you have in watchmakers. There are those people for whom they simply think that watchmakers are lying. And then there are those people who think that the watchmakers should be given the benefit of the doubt and are probably telling the truth. For example, when a watch CEO comes out and says, we sat down and what we did is we took these 3 watches from our collection, we put them in front of the designer and we said, make a modern watch out of these 3 classic Zeniths. There's a group of people who accept that at face value and say that is likely to have occurred. There's another group of people who simply say that's a lie. That what happened is someone gave him a Daytona, someone gave that designer a Daytona, someone gave that designer an old El Primero, and they said, make that El Primero look like a Daytona. And they will not listen to any argument any other way because they think that their natural predilection is that watchmakers lie. Which side of the argument you fell on there influenced everything that came next in how you analyze these watches. The next point I'd say where we differ, and these are another batch of 3 points, and they're all around what matters when you're looking at a watch. The first point there is what representation matters. There were those people who took the view that the key representation, the single most important representation, is that ubiquitous face-on, flat, two-dimensional, looking straight at it image. There were others who said that's actually either not to be considered or really must only be considered in the spectrum of a much larger set of images. You need to see it in video. Preferably you need to see it in the metal. You need to see it from all different angles. Depending on which side you fell on, your analysis came out completely differently. The next sort of point of difference in what matters was which version of the watch matters. Watch brands, watch collections generally have a number of different versions. They have, in this particular case, we were talking about a white version and a black-face version. And if you're talking about the Zenith, not only is it a white and a black, but it's also on a bracelet and on a band. If you looked at take the Zenith and Daytona, if you look at the two blacks, they are miles apart. They have no similarities at all. They have none of that initial sort of kick resemblance. They look like totally different watches. And the differences between the Zenith and the Rolex are stark and undeniable. I'll admit, if you go to the white, they look much more similar, especially in that first unthinking glance. But the question is, which watch do you use as the basis of your comparison in trying to decide whether the Rolex is a knockoff of, sorry, the other way around, whether the Zenith is a knockoff of the Rolex? Do you look at the blacks and compare them, or do you look at the whites and compare them, or do you look at the blacks and the whites together and see how much do they look like each other versus how much they look like the other one? Because I know if I put the black Chronomaster and the white Chronomaster together and then introduce the white-faced Daytona, I just simply don't see a similarity. The Zeniths are clearly a family and they are clearly separate to the Rolexes. Is that a legitimate thing to do? Or should I just be focusing on the whites and whites? Which I'll admit is what I did in my video. Again, that decision of which version of the watch matters was another one of these big dividing points in the community in this argument. And finally, on the idea of what matters, it's what part matters, what part of the watch matters, and what's even part of the watch. For example, one YouTuber, I think it was Adrian from Bark and Jack, at least in another interview, his slam dunk argument that the Zenith is a copy of the Rolex is by looking at the clasp on the bracelet, which I don't even think is part of the watch and therefore isn't even part of the argument. So for me, I don't give a rat's ass how similar the free shoes that come with a suit are. That doesn't mean the suits are the same. And it's the same with a bracelet. They're just free shoes that come with a suit. They're not part of the watch. And if they're similar, who cares? I don't care if they buy them from the same Chinese factory. Not to mention that, well, what does that mean about the band version that you can get of the Chronomaster? Why is it that the bezel is more important than the registers? Why is it the dial color is more important than the case shape? How do you choose which part you focus on and which part was more important to you? Again, had a huge influence on how you ended up coming to your final conclusion. Before I go on, I should say, if I'm looking really sweaty, it's like about 45 degrees Celsius in my little studio at the moment. I am stopping and wiping myself down. I hope I'm not getting too terrible on camera. Okay, so the next point that separates, the next group of points that separates how the community analyzes these watches is exactly that. There are 4 points really around how we do our analysis of the watches in front of us and the representations and what we think. And the first is whether you look at a watch reflexively and instinctively, longitudinally or laterally. And what I mean by that is there are some people whose initial reaction when they look at a watch is to immediately compare it laterally. That is, to current watches that are out in the market from their competitors. So they immediately look at this watch and think of it, how does it look next to a Daytona? How does it look next to a Fortis? How does it look next to a Breitling? How does it look next to an Omega? And they kind of draw the line laterally. There are those other people who look at a watch and immediately think longitudinally. So how does this watch look compared to its predecessor and the other El Primeros in this family? Depending on which way you went with that snap decision of which way you analyzed the watch, again, you came to fundamentally different opinions about this watch and its merit as a designer. Another point of difference in how to analyze a watch was whether you as the reviewer, us, the people in the community, considered a watch look as being owned by a particular brand, or rather that it's just a trope of the genre. So there were people who really focused on the idea that Rolex owned this look. This look was intrinsically Rolex. That was one kind of way of looking at it. Other people looked at those same things, noticed the same similarities, but simply said, that's not a Rolex look, that's just a trope of the genre. That's just something that comes from making a white-faced, ceramic bezel chronograph in the 21st century. That's what it's going to look like. So that point of difference, again, that idea represented a point of divergence in how people looked at these watches. The next point of difference was on the significance of time, and more importantly, what was the significant point of time in which you analyze the success of a watch. That is, and the 2 points that we have here is, do you consider the time at which the design was probably conceived, or do you consider the time at which the design was probably launched? And that's important because quite often we know, or we believe, that generally it's about 3 to 5 years between when a major company says, you know what, I think I might make a watch like this, to when that watch turns up. And that distinction in what point of time you choose as the most significant sort of point of judgment is critical, because quite often what I find is those points of development lead to overlaps. That is, yes, watches may have been conceived within a year or two of each other and then turned up significantly, like turned up 3, 4, 5 years down the track, one in front of the other, and we assume at this point they must have copied them. But if you roll back, they couldn't have known what was coming. That wouldn't have, or they wouldn't have known it was popular. They wouldn't have. It's like, and we just move everything around. We assume that some watch was an icon and clearly influencing a design back at the point it was being conceived. And it just, again, that was a point of difference in the market, in the analysis about what time do I think is important when I'm trying to figure out whether this design is a copy or not. And the final point is really flows on from that last idea of time, and it really captures a whole bunch of things above. And that is, there's a point at which some people would say a designer has an obligation to actively avoid a look, to the point of perhaps even strangling a design at its point of birth and not putting it into the market if it turns out that it looks like something else. The other side of the community says, no, well, big deal. You know, parallel development, parallel evolution is a natural consequence of the complex environment we're in. It is inevitable that you're going to end up with designs in a similar environment, with a similar history, with similar sets of constraints, ending up looking kind of the same. And there's no obligation of the guy who's a little bit later to actively avoid looking like the guy who's a year or two ahead of him. As I said, those are two diametrically opposed points. And depending on what you believe on that point, again, you end up analyzing watches in completely different ways. So, and the next thing I have to say is all of the points I raised above intersect and overlap and reinforce and occasionally weaken each other. You can't really pick one out. And what you would find is sometimes, depending on, for example, what your brand loyalty was at the front, you would find people would swing backwards and forwards on the arguments below to sort of pick and choose and end up at the place they wanted to end up. This is going to pose a challenge for some people moving forward, because if the rumors are true about the certain direction that some Rolexes are taking, and I have no idea if they do go that way or not, but in the event that the Explorer turns up with the black ceramic bezel that some people are talking about, then people on both sides of this argument are going to be challenged. The Rolex people are going to now have to make the Zenith argument, and the Zenith people are now going to have to make the Rolex argument. And it's going to be an interesting test of integrity for us if we can actually keep using the same tools we did on this argument, or whether we somehow give all those up and put ourselves on the opposite side of the argument when it suits us. Whether what we do is kind of irrelevant, though. I think those 10 points of division, I think they'll probably be true then as now, and I look forward to seeing how that plays out in the future. I don't for one instant think that this video is going to resolve anything. I don't think that this video is going to magically make us all sing Kumbaya. What I hope is to say to people, when you're in one of these arguments and it's just going in a death spiral and, you know, doing another lap of the the plug hole before going off down to the sewer. Catch yourself and think about these points of the argument from your opposition's point of view, from the other guy's point of view, and ask yourself, is there something we can talk about in there that might help us resolve the argument? Now, I suspect we won't. I suspect it'll make no difference. But the good thing is, at least it'll give you something different to talk about the next time you're going to whinge about which watch is a knockoff of which. Anyway, that's it. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. Interested in your thoughts below about how you think we, as members of the watch community, in all good faith, end up looking at the same watches and making very different arguments about their merit. Like I said, really interested in your comments. Stick them below. And I'll see you later. Bye.